For 700 years, historians were convinced that the plague, the deadliest pandemic in human history, had come to Europe from China. Textbooks, encyclopedias, and documentaries repeated this narrative, but they were all wrong. The truth lay in the archives of a museum in St. Petersburg, in a skull case that had gone unnoticed since 1886. One of these skulls belonged to a merchant named Sanmak. His story would change everything we thought we knew about the Black Death. The Black Death wasn't just a pandemic. It was an event that completely changed the course of human history. From 1347 to 1353, nearly 200 million people died from it. In some European cities, only 1 in 10 survived. Entire villages were wiped out. Corpses littered the streets because there was no one left to bury them. The economies of many countries collapsed completely. The feudal system began to disintegrate. The church lost its power. Prayer could not stop the disease. It was the end of one world and the beginning of a new one. And during all that time, 7 centuries, no one really knew where it all began. There were theories, guesses, and assumptions. China, India, the Mongolian steppes. Historians argued, but no one had proof. That is, until 2019, when a Scottish historian named Philip Slavin went into archives to study the economic impact of the plague. Slavin pored over grain prices, population data, and trade routes, a boring academic project. But to get the full picture, he decided to check every mention of the plague in historical records, even the oldest and most dubious ones. At some point, he came across a curious entry. In 1889, a Russian archaeologist named Danil Khvolson published a catalog of tombstone inscriptions from Central Asia. Among hundreds of records, a few stood out. Tombstones dating back to 1338 and 1339 containing inscriptions in Syriac. Many of them mentioned plague, an infectious disease, as the cause of death. Khvolson noted this interesting detail and did not return to it. But Slavin realized it could be crucial. 1338 was 9 years before the plague had broken out in Europe. Central Asia lay on the trade route between East and West. Slavin began to dig deeper and discovered that the tombstones came from 2 cemeteries near Lake Issyk-Kul in present-day Kyrgyzstan. In 1885, excavations were carried out there, and archaeologists brought not only copies of the inscriptions to St. Petersburg, but also the skeletons themselves. So Slavin traveled to St. Petersburg, to the Museum of Anthropology and Ethnography. In the storerooms, in old wooden boxes, lay the skulls and bones brought 130 years earlier. Alongside them lay the field expedition's notes. Slavin began to read, unable to believe his eyes. In just 2 years, from 1338 to 1339, 118 people died in this small settlement. For a community of only a few hundred, this was a catastrophic mortality rate. Dozens of tombstones listed the cause of death as the plague. But who were these people? Based on discoveries in the graves, they weren't simple peasants, but Nestorian Christians, merchants on the Silk Road. In their graves, archaeologists have found pearls from the Indian Ocean, coins from Persia, and pottery from the Mediterranean. It was a trade crossroads, a place where caravans from all over the known world passed. Slavin was a historian, not a geneticist. He only theorized, but he understood. If the plague was really the cause, and if these people died from the same horrific disease, it changed everything. He wrote a paper and presented his findings at a conference. There, people who had the resources to test his theory listened. A team of paleogeneticists at the Max Planck Institute in Germany, scientists had been collecting plague DNA from all over the world for several years. From modern rodents, from ancient cemeteries, more than 1,300 samples. They were building something like a family tree of the bacteria to understand how they had changed over time. Then the scientists noticed something strange. In the early 14th century, something happened to the bacteria. From one strain, 4 different versions suddenly appeared. It was as if the bacteria had started mutating at an incredible rate. One of these 4 versions became the plague, which killed half of Europe. But where did this happen? Where was patient 0? When geneticists heard about Slavin's discovery, they knew immediately this could be the answer. But how could they be sure? The skulls had been buried in the ground for nearly 700 years, and then in a museum for another 130. What were the chances that the bacteria's DNA could survive? Ancient DNA usually degrades and breaks down into pieces. But there is one place in the human body where it sometimes survives: the teeth. Enamel protects the pulp inside the tooth, and in this pulp, traces of bacteria from a person's blood can survive until the time of death. A very delicate process began. First, they had to obtain permission to excavate the ancient skulls. After all, these were museum artifacts and historical treasures. Then came the actual procedure. In a sterile laboratory, wearing protective suits so as not to contaminate the samples with modern DNA, the scientists carefully drilled into the teeth of 7 individuals. From the tooth powder, they had to extract DNA, if any remained at all. The first sample, nothing. The second, also empty. The researchers began to doubt. Maybe the DNA hadn't survived. Maybe it wasn't the plague, but some other disease. The third sample, and there it was, faint, but clear DNA from Yersinia pestis. The fourth, again, nothing. The fifth, positive. Eventually, they found plague DNA in 3 of the 7 samples. But finding the DNA was just the beginning. They had to sequence the genome, read the genetic code of the ancient bacteria. It's like a puzzle with 1,000,000 pieces, most of which are missing. The rest faded and bent. Weeks of work followed, along with complex computer algorithms and comparisons with known reference samples. Then the result came in. The scientists looked at the screen and couldn't believe their eyes. The strain from Kyrgyzstan wasn't just one of many plague variants. It was the original strain. It was at the root of that 14th century evolutionary explosion. All 4 of the new strains descended from it. It was the ancestor. Ground zero, the beginning of everything. What's more, comparison with European samples of plague showed a direct correlation. The difference was only 1 or 2 mutations. It was like tracing a family tree and finding a great-great-great-grandparent. There was no longer any doubt. The plague that wiped out half of Europe had originated here, in the Tian Shan Mountains, in 1338. But how did an animal disease suddenly become a human disease? The area around Lake Issyk-Kul is a natural reservoir for plague. The bacteria have been circulating among local rodents, marmots, gerbils, and voles for thousands of years. Usually, they stay in this natural cycle and don't affect humans. But sometimes a zoonotic leap occurs. The disease jumps to a new species. Scientists have examined climate data from this period. The 1330s were a time of unusual weather conditions in the area. There were many warm, wet springs in succession. Vegetation grew lushly and food was plentiful. The number of rodents increased dramatically. More rodents means more fleas. More fleas means a greater chance that an infected flea will bite a human. Perhaps a hunter caught a marmot for dinner. Perhaps children played near rodent burrows. Perhaps fleas entered someone's house on thatch or firewood. We'll never know the exact time of transmission. But the result is clear. People started dying. First one person, then his family, then his neighbors. Within 2 years, 118 people died in the small settlement. But why wasn't the disease confined to a local outbreak? Why didn't it burn out and disappear, as it usually does? The answer lies in the nature of the place itself. The settlement was located on the Silk Road. Caravans passed through it, connecting China with Europe. Traders from India, Persia, and Byzantium rested here. Now imagine a caravan traveling west. Hidden among the wagons laden with goods are black rats, common companions of humans at that time. Fleas are found on the rats, and some of these fleas carry the plague. The caravan moves slowly, 20 to 30 kilometers a day, stopping at caravans and markets. The rats jump from caravan to caravan, from house to house. The fleas find new hosts. The disease spread like wildfire along the trade route. From Issyk-Kul to the Black Sea, over 3,000 kilometers. The plague took about 8 years to cover this distance. A slow but unstoppable journey through Samarkand, Bukhara, and Khiva, across the Caspian steppes to the Black Sea ports. In 1346, the plague reached Crimea. And there, something happened that will forever go down in history. The Golden Horde laid siege to the Genoese fortress of Kaffa, modern-day Feodosia. A deadly disease broke out in the Mongol army. Hundreds of soldiers died. Then the Mongol Khan made a horrific decision. He wanted to use the disease as a weapon. The rotting corpses were loaded onto catapults and hurled over the city walls. This was the first documented use of biological warfare in history. The Genoese were terrified. They had no idea what the disease was, or how it spread, or how to protect themselves. Their only option was to flee. They boarded ships and sailed back to Italy. In October 1347, 12 Genoese ships arrived in the Sicilian port of Messina. On board were dying sailors and rat-infested cargo. The local authorities quickly realized that the ships had brought the plague and forced them to leave port. But it was too late. The rats fled ashore. The fleas found new hosts. The plague reached Europe. What followed was like a forest fire, from Sicily to the Italian mainland, from Italy to France, from France to England. In just 6 years, the epidemic swept across the entire continent, from Portugal to Russia. But let's return to our merchant Sanmak, a simple man whose name survived by chance. On a stone, he lived, traded, and raised children. He had plans, hopes, and dreams. In 1338, he began to feel unwell. He developed a fever and his lymph nodes swelled. He died a few days later. He was buried according to Christian custom, and a headstone bearing an inscription in Syriac was placed on his grave. Sanmak had no idea that he was the first link in a chain of events that would change the world. That his illness would kill a third of Europe's population. That kingdoms would collapse, religions would change, and history would be rewritten. He had no idea that 700 years later, scientists would examine his remains, that his name would appear in scientific papers, and that documentaries would be made about him. The discovery that the Black Death originated in Kyrgyzstan serves not only historical purposes, but is an important lesson for the present. We see how easily it can become a human disease, how climate change creates ideal conditions for the transmission of zoonotic diseases, how trade routes become routes for the transmission of deadly infections, how a single sick person in a remote village can cause a global pandemic. We live in a world where an airplane can fly from Asia to Europe in 8 hours, not 8 years like the caravans of the 14th century. A world where 7 billion people are connected in a single network, where the destruction of natural ecosystems constantly creates new opportunities for viruses and bacteria to jump to humans. The story of Sanmak and the plague is not just a tale from the past, it is a warning for the future. Forgotten skulls in a museum in St. Petersburg held a secret for 7 centuries. It took the perseverance of a historian, the skills of geneticists, and a little luck to unravel it. Now we know the Black Death didn't start in China, India, or the steppes of Mongolia. It began in 1338 in a small trading settlement near Lake Issyk-Kul in the Tian Shan Mountains. It began with an ordinary merchant named Sanmak. It began with the bite of a single infected fly, which changed the course of human history.